Good morning. We're having an interesting time in Scotland, and the independence movement is facing some of the most challenging moments it's had, some of the most exciting, and the ones with the greatest potential. The gender issue perhaps is not the ideal issue that this confrontation and this face down over the fundamentals of Scotland as an independent country, Scotland as a devolved nation, and the role of the law and the will of the people, and to some degree, given the state of affairs in the Union, the law versus the will of the people, which is a very delicate area to get into. However, the Herald today has a few interesting points. Come first of all to Neil Mackay. Now, those of you who follow my Twitter feed, or much that I've said at all over the last few years, will know that I've had very mixed feelings about Neil Mackay's journalism. Way back, when the Herald was the first paper, Sunday Herald, to come out for independence, I applauded Neil Mackay and saw him clearly as an asset to the independence movement. Subsequent to that, for a variety of reasons, Neil has struck me as being highly equivocal in his yes support and in his choice of arguments. I give him the benefit of the doubt and accept at face value what he says, that he was a yes voter and he's in favour of Scottish independence. But he has a very odd way of showing it at times, mainly because of his criticisms of the SNP and his dissatisfaction with the SNP in many respects. Now, I think most people in the Yes movement at one time or another have not been entirely satisfied with the behaviour of the SNP. That's the nature of your relationship with your party, whether it's a party of which you're a member, which I used to be but I'm now not, or a party to whom you give support and see them as representative of your core views, which I very definitely am. I see SNP as the undisputed, definitive leader of the Yes movement, of the independence movement, but lacking in certain essentials on that. Anyway, let's get back to Neil Mackay. He opens today with what I think is a finely judged paragraph, and I agree with it wholeheartedly. The conflict between the Union and Scottish Government over Holyrood's gender legislation is an acid bath for Scotland. It reveals so much so unpleasantly. Yet perhaps it's also the moment of clarity the nation has needed for years, and not just the nation. The SNP, the Yes movement, Scottish Labour, Scottish Tories, undecided voters, Scotland's media, all of us. For that paragraph, I'd almost forgive Neil all my other reservations. However, in the article, it goes on to show, in my view, and that's my view and the only one I have to offer, the kind of contradictions there often are in Neil's articles. He often seems to contradict his own argument in one paragraph versus another. Indeed, often it's very difficult to be able to say this was the central thrust of Neil's argument. But let's just take a few samples. Well, here's a great blinding glimpse of, I think, the obvious, but it's always useful to restate it. Independence means a nation taking its own decisions, whether good or bad. There is no world in which any future independent Scotland would make everyone happy. I agree with that wholeheartedly. It's the nature of democracy. A newly independent Scotland could theoretically vote in a right-wing government causing outrage among the left, and that is entirely a possibility. Is that a reason to ditch independence? Clearly not, if you believe in self-determination. So Neil there states effectively what I believe and have said many times, He goes on to say, if Scotland chooses independence, we cannot go running to London to overturn laws we don't like, because London won't be there. If Scotland became independent tomorrow, the most likely government would be the SNP, and it would pass this gender law. The next thing is perhaps the crux of this whole gender issue. Those in the Yes movement calling for London to act now have been branded traitors and hypocrites by people they once campaigned with. This has been a sore point with many of us, and while I would never brand them as traitors and hypocrites, I do really question what the hell they think they're about. And I have particularly low sympathy for those SNP MSPs who went against their party in the debate. Yes, it was a free vote, but they knew the score, they knew how important this was, and I will never feel entirely the same about some of them as I did before. Some of them simply confirmed what I'd thought of them always, and expected no better from them in this or any other issue or forum. Neil goes on to say it's confusing for many in the Yes movement to see people who once denounced the Tories as monsters now backing Conservative attacks on Scottish devolution. They scratch their head wondering how a party which has, in the eyes of the Yes movement, been wrong on everything suddenly become the arbiter of sense and wisdom. So I think I'll leave my quotations from Neil for that and say, while the overall article, I think, for me, leaves much to be desired, he has said things that are very important, and it's undoubtedly worth reading. Forgive me while I fiddle a bit. Right, now, let me go back to another journalist that I admire enormously, Alison Rowat. And whatever she writes on, she's a coherent journalist with a fine command, lucid command of English. She's mordant, she's relevant, she's factual. I couldn't honestly say, as I'm usually prepared to say with most journalists, I think she leans to the yes or the no. But she certainly is a fine journalist. So let's have a look at what she's saying. Forgive me. Right. Now, can I say the headlines in the Herald, when they're not actively spinning by a headline, which they're very, very guilty of, and they may not see it as something to be guilty of, they may see it as part of their duty. But very often it's not spinning, it's simply that headlines, limited as they are, often don't really give the flavour of what follows. And that's often the case, I find, with Alison's articles. I'm assuming that she doesn't write her own headlines. So the headline that comes up, Herald opinion, stop rushing to the courts, First Minister, and start talks. Now that struck me as negative in a couple of senses. Anyway, it doesn't really reflect the true complexity and relevance of what Alison goes on to say. So let me quote some of this. She opens, as of Monday, we're back to intergovernmental relations conducted as a pub fight in EastEnders. Both sides out on the pavement, broken glass all around, and cries of leave it, they're not worth it, filling the night air. That conjures up not only the present situation, but almost any EastEnders episode I've ever had the misfortune to watch. You may say, why did I see any of them? Well, there are members of my family who love EastEnders, and God bless them, they're right. Alison goes on to say, how tempting it is to walk away and leave them to it. A plague on both their houses. We were just about coping with the notion of the general election being used as a de facto referendum, whatever that means, And now another runaway train, the Section 35 Express, is hurtling down the track. Johnny Cash jumps into my mind at that point. Powerful images conjured. How much constitutional drama can one small but beautifully formed nation be expected to take? If I could write half as well as Alison, I'd be content. Right, more, Alison. Let's hear what you have to say. Here she's music to my ears. On the grounds that no problem that was ever solved quicker for the involvement of lawyers, because it will cost the Scottish taxpayer another fortune in fees if legal action goes ahead, the sensible solution here would be to get round the table. Now, I agree wholeheartedly with that, and those of you who look at my Twitter feed will have seen my many comments and views on Nicola's. You can either describe it as respect for the law or my description as tending to be a prisoner of the law and addicted to the law in preference to any other course of action. And my big fear in this was that Nicola would leap straight into the legal arena, and it looks like that's what she's going to do. Now, you may say, what else could she do? Well, she could behave for once, totally, fully, wholeheartedly, bravely, publicly, as an independence leader, and address the issue for what it is, a craven assault on Scotland's democracy, and on an issue that attempts to help a very marginalised but small group in our society who have been and are being still abominably treated. And it reflects the recognition that there is within our society, not so much within Scotland, I don't believe, but certainly within England and at the highest level, not only homophobia, but a fear of anything that is different. A sexual morality that wouldn't have been out of place in a Spanish Inquisition court. So I think this law is right. The other factor, of course, is that this law is not actually doing anything very radical. It's doing something very important to clarify the law, but it's doing what a large number of other countries in the world have already done successfully and haven't been beset by the hordes of bogeymen that are conjured up by Alister Jack, who I've now taken to call Jack the Union. As a Scottish secretary, he's, what can I say? He's the Union's man over Scotland, not Scotland's man in the Union. He's Jack the Union. He's got a Union Jack branded on his forehead, emblazoned on his chest, and probably on his underpants. I have no fondness or respect for Alister Jack at all. He comes across as a bumbling landowner Tory, which to some degree he probably is. But beneath that, there's something else which I definitely do not like, and that's a personal Dr. Fell type opinion. I do not like the Dr. Fell, exactly why I cannot tell, but I do not like the Dr. Fell. So there we have it. I hope that doesn't give rise to litigation, or he can be equally nasty to me. Please feel free, Alister, to miscall me if you anywhere on your radar at all. Right, go on to the estimable Alison Rowat. Hard to say what was the biggest giveaway. Maybe it was the breaking off from the dry legal wording in his letter, this is Alison, to point out the chilling effect the bill would have on single-sex spaces, playing to the gallery there. Or was it his published reasons for blocking the bill after he got his feet in the Commons, giving MPs barely any time to digest the details? And that was a nasty thing. Actually, there's a letter writer in the Herald today expressing great regret for the abominable way in which Alister Jack was treated by the opposition MPs. I think he's lucky he wasn't treated considerably more vigorously, and in older UK parliaments of yore he might well have been. Seeing how close he is to the former Prime Minister, one wonders if Mr. Johnson has been giving him the benefit of his advice on how to rile the Scots. Alison goes on elsewhere to cite just why she believes he's close to Johnson. If you remember Johnson's farewell and the tight little group of his loving supporters who surrounded him at that time, who contained people like Rhys Mogg and Nadine Dorries, and one Alister Jack, you'll get the flavour of what Alison was saying. Another pointed reference. There will those who say Miss Sturgeon shouldn't bother with any talks. She should just sit back and relish the fight with London, play it for all the votes it's worth, because negotiation brings with it the risk of defeat. Well, as one of the areas which I do claim expertise and many decades of experience, negotiation brings with it the prospect of agreement or failure to agree, or a word used, it's not much used by negotiators, compromise. In other words, finding a position which both parties find tenable, which involves both of them surrendering some of their position. There is a very real risk of that bringing defeat if it wasn't handled very carefully. I think Nicola should deal with Rishi Sunak, or whoever Rishi Sunak chooses to field, with vigour, assertion as an independence leader, saying this is the way it's going to be, up with this we will not put. We're open to intelligent discussion of, frankly, how you're going to back off from this position, UK, and how we're going to get this law onto the statute books without further ado, because make it clear, Rishi, we are going to enact this law. Again, perceptive Alison Rowat goes on to say, Mr. Jack has built an elephant trap, one so big that it can be seen from space, so work around it. Take Michelle Obama's advice. When they go low, you go high. Be the bigger politician. Smother your opponent in reasonableness. Flow them with your arguments. If none of that works, consider going to court. But going to court has very little chance of success here. It's the Scotland Act. It's an interpretation of the Scotland Act by the architects of the Scotland Act, Westminster. It's a Tory government, and they're going to use the Scotland Act to bounce the thing all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, probably, a tiny chink of possibility that the Supreme Court will back the Scotland Act and the government. Alison goes on to say she caught an interview with Henry McLeish. Well, I've got little to say about Henry McLeish. I don't think he's a bad man. He's a Labour man. I think he probably lost his first ministership, unfortunately, and unfairly, on what was a relatively minor and genuine misjudgment. But since then, he's been, forgive the French, I quote, as shit or get off the pot, Henry, constantly dithering on the edge of supporting independence, and certainly not being one of the Labour people, ex-people who are sometimes described as grandees by the Herald. If the Herald likes them, they're a grandee. If, like Jim Sillars, if the Herald doesn't, they're not. Henry McLeish has tried to be reasonable, but he comes across as equivocal, and a man in Macaulay's, I can't remember the story in Macaulay's exact words, caught between two conflicting choices, seemingly unaware that they can never be reconciled. So we'll pass over Henry McLeish. Alison pins it. Miss Sturgeon has the added difficulty that she will be dealing with the Conservatives. But again, let us be positive. It's hard to be positive in any discussion of the Conservatives, but I understand the need to do it, Alison. Think of it as a test because you can be sure the public will see it that way. If the First Minister and her colleagues cannot deal with the likes of Mr. Jack on a relatively straightforward, though controversial matter such as this, it hardly bodes well for Scotland in any independence negotiation. So, thank you, Alison. Thank you for a fine article, and a qualified thank you to Neil Mackay. For the Yes movement, for anybody interested in this, I believe that some sectors of the Yes movement, including some quite close to me, have underrated the significance of this. It may be the January blues, it may be fatigue over COVID, Christmas, New Year, everything else, but certainly social media has seemed either dead or pursuing trivialities. And they don't seem to realise the centrality of this argument. So this is me, an old man giving his view, no more, no less than that. But I do believe this is vitally important, and I'll stay with it, and it has at least one desirable effect for me. It summons the adrenaline and the energy that an old man like me so badly needs to keep his nose to the grindstone when he could be doing nicer things and probably better things with his family and friends and music. But I do my best, as they say. Bye.